Good morning, everybody. And today's subject is about socialism. So it's the next in our study of all the different political ideologies. So up until this point, we've covered liberalism and conservatism. And these are arguments that society should be basically, well, either the way it is now or with very few changes. And we're going to look at an ideology today that favors a lot of economic and social change. So socialism should firstly be understood as that. It's an ideology that promotes a lot of economic and social change. To do this, we'll also look into the debates within socialism. And a primary one is the debate between social democracy and socialism. Right? They're both rooted in socialist thinking, but then you see that the longer history progresses, the more different social democrats and socialists become. So what's the basis of this difference? Why do they have such big disagreements with each other? We'll look at Marxism as well, and it's a very, very short period of time to cover Marxism. It's just one lecture, and all these things have their own internal logic and quite complicated. But this is an introduction course. So we'll look at the basic components of Marxism as an ideology, and the debates that exist within Marxism as well about what to do about politics. So the starting point, I suppose it's clear from the introduction, is that there isn't a single socialism. Even though people talk about socialism as if it has a singular existence. So in the current day and age, everybody from Barack Obama all the way to more radical leaders like Hugo Chavez or Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela get described as socialist. And this is because in the contemporary understanding, socialism is understood as any form of government intervention into the economy. By that definition, of course, Macau and many countries in the world would be seen as socialist countries when it's clear that they're probably not. Right? So we'll see today that political figures justify many things in the name of socialism, or argue against many types of government policy by saying that it's socialist. Right? Which doesn't help you very much because it makes the terms very unclear. Right? So in order to begin our understanding of socialism, we need to find out what are the basic components of socialism. Is there something that all socialists agree on? And let's see what those are. So the basic parts of socialism I put here are firstly an optimistic view of human nature. Compare this to liberalism and conservatism, which has a not very optimistic view of human nature, a negative view. Right? Conservatives believe human nature is limited. Liberals believe human nature is kind of like a mob. People all get together and tyrannize minorities and things like that. Secondly, cooperation is seen as a good thing in socialism. Previously we've seen arguments from liberals, for example, that there's no such thing as society or things like that, or that individuals are more important than cooperation in a group. Socialism argues for cooperation. We see a positive view of freedom. Remember back to a few lectures ago, we talked about the difference between positive and negative freedom, where negative freedom is your freedom from intervention and positive freedom is what you can do. Socialists are more likely to support positive freedom, and we have support for equality. So whereas liberals' primary value is freedom, conservatives' primary value is stability or tradition, socialists' primary value is equality. And we'll see how that works in a minute. So socialists have an optimistic view of human nature, and by this they say that, well, either human nature is a changeable thing, in other words, it's determined in a lot by society, and if it's determined by society, and if society can change, then human nature can change as well. Right? So most socialists will argue that there's not one single human nature that we have. We don't have an essence as humans. What we see as human nature is actually a changing thing. Our natural behavior changes over time in response to changes in society. So human behavior is the result of a social construct, which is where broad social forces like anything from traditions to culture to the way your parents teach you things determine what human nature is. Right? So this raises the question, okay, when somebody is born a boy or a girl, do they inherently behave like a boy or a girl, or is it because their parents teach them how to be a boy or a girl from a young age and socialize them into a certain gender? Right? So socialists tend to emphasize a view that says people's human nature is socially constructed if it's socially constructed, we can change people's human nature into something better than what it currently is. Secondly, socialists emphasize cooperation. First of all, to take political power, because socialists really want political power in order to make the changes that they make. We'll see later in the lecture, Lenin's theory of the vanguard talks about cooperation between highly conscious political activists and how they're going to take power on behalf of the working class. And the working class also has to cooperate with itself in order to take power. Right. Secondly, once you do have power, socialists generally believe that society should be organized cooperatively. So government taking control of the economy or workers taking ownership of the economy are examples of this. And part of the socialist critique of capitalism is that competition produces a large amount of waste. So we could look at, bottled water as a good example. There's lots of companies that sell packaged water. They all spend a lot of money on advertising for what's basically the same commodity, right? Water is the same, no matter what. Everybody drinks the same water. All the bottled water companies sell the same water to you. But they're manufacturing it as something that's different, right? They put their branding on it, they spend millions of dollars on advertising to convince you to buy one company's water more than the other, even though it's the same thing. This is obviously tremendously wasteful. It's like the difference between Coke and Pepsi is similar, right? It's basically the same drink, marketed in a different way. So part of the socialist critique of capitalism is that this wastes a lot of money. People who produce nothing and just convince people to buy one commodity over another, get significant benefits, and a lot of money is wasted as a result of the way that capitalism is. Socialists have a positive view of freedom, and by this we mean that they emphasize your ability to do stuff more than your freedom from government intervention or things like that. So there's questions like, okay, you might have a legal ability to read and write, but can you actually learn if you don't have resources to learn? If you never go to school, if you never have money, if you never do those things, right? Can you actually learn things? Similarly, you might have a legal right to vote and participate in politics, but for example, to win the US presidential election, you won't have a single chance in hell of winning it unless you have millions of dollars of campaign funding. Right? So does everybody have the same right to access political power? Socialists will say no. So equality is the socialists' basic political value. We can compare this, like I said, to liberalism, which emphasizes freedom. Conservatism emphasizes tradition or stability. And therefore, you hear lots of different words that mean something like equality when we describe socialism. One important word is egalitarian. Egal means equal in lots of languages. And egalitarian means a way of thinking that's based on equality. So this belief that people are equal, deserve equal rights, equal opportunities. And lots of different forms of socialism all agree that people should be equal in the end. Right? The primary way that socialists disagree with each other is about how to reach this equal society. But all socialists agree with the concept of an equal society. Right? So their main disagreement is, how do we actually get to an equal society? An anarchist socialist, for example, would say we need to smash the whole state today and the society will become equal immediately. Right? A Marxist-Leninist tends to think that you need to have a period where you construct socialism and build it and defend it. There are other forms of socialism, like social democracy, thinks that we can reach socialism in a very peaceful and slow way. Right? But they all want the same thing in the end, which is a much more equal society than what we have at the moment. So there's a concept which we call utopia. This is an accusation often thrown at socialists, is that they're utopian, they want a perfect world. Right? So utopia means a perfect world. And if you're a utopian person, you're the type of person who wants a world that has no negative things about it, that it's completely positive and not negative. Right? So many conservatives and liberals criticize socialists by saying, you're trying to achieve an impossible goal, you want a perfect society, we can never be perfect, so your attempts to perfect society actually cause negative consequences. Socialists themselves, though, disagree with each other about whether utopia is a good thing or not. And we'll see an example of this disagreement. So, for example, the following quote from Oscar Wilde says that a map of the world that does not include Utopia is not worth glancing at, means looking at. It leaves out the one country at which humanity is always landing, and when humanity lands there, it looks out and seeing a better country sets sail. So progress is the realization of Utopia. So Wilde here is making the point that whenever we've had human history progress, it's the result of some person somewhere imagining a better society and how it could be, imagining a perfect society and struggling towards that perfect society. And even if they can't completely achieve this perfect society, just the simple fact that they're able to imagine it helped bring people to a higher level, helped bring human beings closer to this perfect world. And even if we never reach it, it's kind of not the point. You know, imagining the perfect world helps us reach a better world than what we currently do. And if we can't do that, we're really limiting our ability to do politics well. Right? So thinking in a utopian way lets us consider all of the different possible options, not just the ones we think are realistic. And this is important because it allows us to imagine very big political changes. Right? So if you were Mao in the 1920s and you're telling the world that, well, we can eventually become a socialist country and free of colonial domination, you'd sound pretty stupid, right? You'd sound utopian if you want, because it's so far away from the reality that you have that it's almost unimaginable. You know, or if you're India in the 1920s, colonized by the British, completely dominated society. If you're telling people you can be free and an independent country and that most of the world's colonies are going to collapse once you become independent, right? That seems utopian. It seems unimaginable, right? So Wilde's argument is really that impossible things become possible because we struggle towards them. You know, that the human spirit in a way is capable of a lot more than we perhaps believe. And so against this is arguments for what we call scientific socialism, which is associated typically with Marx and Engels. Now, their theory of socialism is based on this idea that, well, socialism is not a moral argument. It's not an argument that the world would be nicer or fairer or better if it was socialist, even though they do agree that it would be. But that's kind of not the point. Marx and Engels connect socialism and science, and they say that, well, not only is socialism better, but all of the changes that are happening in the world in all of history, leading up until now, are leading towards a socialist society. It's an inevitable transition that's going to happen. Right? So socialism will happen whether certain people like it or not. Right? And it's scientifically going to happen. So to introduce Marx, he did lots of things. Like he's a philosopher, sociologist, historian, economist, journalist, and even a revolutionary. He participated in the Paris Commune, which is a revolutionary uprising. So his main contributions in political theory include surplus value is a kind of theory about how working people get exploited by capitalists. So in a monetary way, so how does their value get taken away by capitalists and turned into profit? How do the capitalists become rich and how do the working class stay poor? Historical materialism is the analysis of class, society, and history. Marxists look at history in a different way than most people, and they say that history is conditioned by class struggles, so big struggles between different social forces. We'll look at that in a minute. And alienation, which we don't have time to discuss today in depth, but this is the way that people are taken away from their essence in capitalism. So when capitalists take away your work, they're not just making money out of it, they're taking away the essence of who you are, right? So your life's work is removed from you and turned into profit. Alienation is the total loss of control that you have within a capitalist society. So it's a pretty interesting concept. And then we have Engels. Engels underlines why it's important to have a rich friend. Marx was notoriously poor for most of his life because he sort of spent most of it writing. Engels was from a rich family and so helped get Marx's work published. In fact, most of us would not have read Marx's work if it wasn't for Engels. But in his own right, Engels made contributions to political theory too. He invented the term the dictatorship of the proletariat, which we'll talk about in a minute. He made significant contributions to feminist theories of the family. So when we do feminism, probably next week, We'll look at Engels' writings on feminism, and he synthesized and developed Marx's work. So Marx died suddenly and unexpectedly, and there were a lot of leftover manuscripts and note papers, which then Engels turned into books eventually by bringing the work together. So it's a very short amount of time we have to talk about Marxism, just one lecture or part of one lecture, but as an introduction, we can divide Marxism into 4 basic components. So it's a theory of class conflict, a theory of revolution, a theory of history, and a theory of society. Marxism is a theory of class conflict in the sense that it divides the world into different social classes. For example, the capitalist class are the people who own the means of production. The working class are the people who don't own the means of production and have to work. All right? And there's other intermediate classes like the petty bourgeoisie, so the small capitalist class, who have some means of production but not enough to not work. Right? And in previous social histories, before capitalism, there were different social classes, like slave classes or landlords or feudal classes or things like that. Right? So, in other words, it's a theory of class conflict that says if the primary thing that shapes the way society works is the struggle between different social classes, and as we're in a capitalist society, the primary social classes are the capitalist class and the working class, and they're locked in this desperate struggle with each other. Right, so there's a basic division in society between people who live because they work, the working class, and people who live because they employ other people and make profit, the capitalist class. Right? And there are differences within these groups. It's the basic structure of society is this. So, class conflict, also known as class struggle or class war, or there's lots of, the reason we use violent metaphors for this is because it's supposed to be this tension in society between different socio-economic interests that are locked in a battle between each other. Right? So within Marxist political theory, the main difference between Marxists and liberals is that they look at something like violence, and liberals will say violence is when A hurts B, kills them or stabs them or beats them or does something physical to B. Right? The difference within Marxism is that violence can come from many different places. If you die because you're poor, the capitalist system has killed you, right? If you die because you're in the workplace and you get a workplace injury, that's part of the class struggle as well. If you die because of a mine explosion or if you die because of a construction site accident, that's class struggle too, right? Because capitalists don't die because of workplace injuries, only working class people do, right? So this is another example of the difference between the Marxist concept of violence and the liberal concept of violence. Marxists think of harm as being the product of the whole social system. But class struggle is also other things, like if you're unemployed, if you don't have a job, right? That's part of the anarchy of capitalism. It gives some people jobs and some people don't have jobs. It gives some people high wages and some people no wages, right? So the struggle over wages too, that's part of the class struggle. So the class struggle is this overarching concept that covers everything between the difference between social economic interests all the way down to struggles over wages, unemployment, the way capitalism works, that sort of thing. Marxism is also a theory of revolution. At least it starts out as a revolutionary ideology, right? We'll see in a minute that modern social democrats don't believe in revolution anymore, but they once did. So why do Marxists think that revolution is going to happen? Why do Marxists think that we currently live in a class society, but that we're going to end up in a classless society one day, right? The basic reason for this, in theory, is this contradiction that exists between the development of productive forces and the relations that we have to the means of production. Now, we can understand the development of productive forces as being, all of the things that exist in the world that make the society economically what it is. So how do we reproduce ourselves? How do we accumulate wealth? How do we maintain our social existence? For most human history, the world has not been able to produce enough things to sustain everybody in a comfortable way. That's why we have things like famine or scarcity or stuff like that. There's not enough things for everybody. Not enough things for everybody to become comfortable. Now, what's different about capitalist society, what's different about the world that we live in today, is that currently the economy of the world makes more than is necessary for everybody to live comfortably. Right? There's more than enough for everybody to have food and clothing and basic shelter and stuff like that. Right? And it's the only time in history where this has been true. For most history, we haven't been able to do that. So Marxists will argue that suddenly there's this contradiction where technical development has reached a point where there's no reason for anybody to suffer or struggle at all. But the political division in society between people who have stuff and people who don't is substantial. And this causes a kind of crisis where the society is such that people shouldn't be poor and yet there are poor people. The society is such that people shouldn't be poor and yet some people are still poor. And this also creates an economic contradiction where in order to make money, capitalists have to sell things to people, but people don't have enough money to spend on all the capitalist things that they want to sell. So this creates regular economic crises within capitalism where too much stuff is made, what we call overproduction, and it causes the system to collapse on a recurring basis. Right? So there is this contradiction between a world based on private property and the fact that there's enough for everybody to have a comfortable living. Marxism is also a theory of history. If we look at other theories of history, what we see is kind of the great man view of history. Most people would look at, take Chinese history for example, and they'll, well, there's currently Xi Jinping, and before him there was, Hu Jintao, and before him there was Jiang Zemin, and before him there was like Deng Xiaoping, and before him there was Mao, and before that there was a bunch of other guys, and there was the Qing dynasty, and basically before that there was some other important kings and rulers, and it's just a series of important people one after the other. Okay? So Marxism does not believe in this view of history, the important man view of history. It completely rejects it in favor of what we call historical materialism. Now this is a way of looking at history that says, well, history instead is shaped by big, broad social forces, in particular social classes, fight with each other all the time, and that's the defining thing of history. It's not that it changes all of history, but when big historical change happens, it usually happens because of some sort of class struggle. Right? So Marx looks at most societies and says that they progress through different modes of production, starting with a communal mode of production. It's based on hunter-gatherer societies that have a low level of development, but also no social divisions. Right? Hunter-gatherer societies are very egalitarian. They share everything, they do everything together, there's no division of labor, that sort of thing. All the way up to a capitalist society, which is our current society, which is a society with a high level of development, but there's antagonistic social classes. In other words, the workers' and capitalists' interests are opposed. Right? And Marxists then make a key claim, is that, well, if there's other previous versions of society, capitalism didn't always exist. Why would we believe that capitalism will always exist? Right? If there have been other different societies before, surely there can be other different societies in the future, and eventually we'll get to those societies as a result. So here's the science in socialism, I suppose. They really believe that we're developing towards these new societies. So, because of this contradiction between productive forces and the relations of production, Marxists say that revolutionary change from one system to another is inevitable at some point. It's not going to happen right now, but at some point it will happen. Capitalism was inevitable. Even though we had feudalism for a very long time, thousands of years, we had the system before capitalism. But the transition to capitalism was inevitable at some point because eventually it was always going to happen because of the struggle between different social classes. Right? So this leads to an important conclusion, which is that even when revolutions fail, and if we look at the 20th century, lots of revolutions failed, lots of people tried to establish socialism and were immediately unsuccessful. Other people tried to establish socialism and succeeded for a while and then didn't, or succeeded for quite a long time. If you take the Soviet Union and then collapsed. None of that is relevant because there will always be the next revolution. As long as capitalism is an unstable system, it will always produce the conditions for future revolutions because it's not resolved its basic crisis. Marxism is also a theory of society, and it says that the defining feature of capitalism as a social system is that it exploits the working class, but in exploiting the working class, it has an important impact on workers themselves. You know, the experience of exploitation makes the workers more revolutionary than they previously was. You know, Marx says capitalism produces its own grave diggers in the Communist Manifesto, I think. And this is arguing that, well, the experience of capitalism itself turns workers against capitalism because nobody likes being exploited. You know, nobody likes it. So it makes you more active in politics and more supportive of change against capitalism. Right? So things like organizing workers into factories contribute to the politicization of the working class because it brings them into contact with other working class people, and they all talk about how bad capitalism is and how badly they're paid and stuff like that, and it makes them more politically active. Right? So we can compare this with other forms of socialism, which we'll see in a minute, that don't see capitalism as a self-destructing system. Marxism says capitalism will self-destruct. You know, it will create systems of crisis repetitively until such time as the system gets overthrown by a different political system. Now, in the 20th century, we see the first divisions within socialism between two groups of people. One we'll call social democrats, the other we'll call socialists or communists. And this emerged mostly in response to the Russian Revolution. And people, I guess, either supported or opposed the Russian Revolution. More or less, if you supported the Russian Revolution and thought it was mostly good, you became known as a socialist or a communist. And if you opposed the Russian Revolution but still supported socialism as a way, you became known as a social democrat. And this started off, I mean, there was a period in time where they were all part of the same political parties. But after this split, social democrats and communists become more and more different over time, and now they're sort of very different. So what are the basic features of social democracy? Social democrats support reformist change, so very slow, piecemeal changes to the current system. They support parliamentary socialism, so they believe in getting elected, and as long, well, working class is the majority, so we just need to get everybody to vote for us, and as long as they do that, we can change the society, you know, that type of parliamentary logic to socialism. They think that socialism can involve the whole nation. Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet thinker, said that he'd established the state of the whole people. And this is basically an argument that says, well, every social class in society can agree with socialism. It's not just for the working class. Everybody can agree with it. And this is based on the idea that socialism is a moral thought. So in other words, socialism is nice, socialism is desirable, socialism is fair, stuff like that, right? Marxism is different to this in the sense that Marxism emphasizes revolutionary change. You know, most Marxist governments have come to power through revolution. It emphasizes government through workers' councils or Soviets. So the working class is supposed to take power for itself and is supposed to contribute to government itself. Not through parliament, but through direct control. Marxists support both legal and illegal political strategies. I mean, because it's a theory that says you need to overthrow the government and replace the existing society with a socialist society, it's very hard to do that legally. You know, every Marxist in history who's been successful has done something illegal at some point, right? It's impossible to argue against that, right? The Chinese Revolution was illegal, the Russian Revolution was illegal, the Vietnamese Civil War was illegal. You basically have to support some form of illegal activity if you want to be a Marxist. You know, there's the harsh news. For Marxists, socialism is a theory by and for the exploited classes. In other words, it doesn't matter if capitalists like socialism or not. In fact, it's very likely that they're not going to like it because it involves them losing power and property, right? So Marxists don't try and convince everybody that socialism is a good idea. Say, well, it's enough that the workers like socialism because there's more of them than there is everybody else, right? We don't have to convince everybody. You know, we have to go out of your way to convince every social class to support socialism. Just the people who are going to take power, just the people who are necessary to establish socialism. So one possible critique of social democracy, and one that's often made, is that it really doesn't stand for anything. Social democrats make many compromises in politics, and to an extent it becomes very difficult to tell the difference between a liberal, some types of conservatives, and some types of social democrats, because they seem to agree on so many things. Take a liberal like John Rawls, who wants a fairer society, he wants to redistribute property, he wants people to be relatively equal, and yet he's still liberal, right? But he seems a lot like social democrats who want the same things, right? So Marxists often criticize social democrats because they compromise to the extent that change no longer becomes meaningful. The changes that social democrats argue for become very small and very, very tolerant of the existing way the society is. Let's look at a theorist of social democracy. We have Edward Bernstein. Now, Bernstein argued the following things. He said that in Europe in his time, the number of small and medium enterprises was growing. And this seems to be the opposite of what Marxism was suggesting is true. Marxism says that there is a polarization between workers and capitalists. The capitalists get richer, the workers get made poorer. And he said that, well, empirically, if we look at Europe, the number of people running small businesses is getting more. Right? So maybe Marx is wrong about capitalism then. I mean, Marx was probably right about capitalism if we look at the whole world, right? Because at the time he was wrong about Europe, maybe. Right, so secondly, Bernstein argued that Marxist value theory, and particularly the theory of economic crisis, was wrong. You know, Bernstein lived in a period where capitalism was relatively stable over a number of decades. So it seemed like maybe they found the answer. Maybe capitalism is going to be stable finally. You know, it's kind of like, I don't know, if we lived sometime between the 1890s and 1930s, or sometime between 1972 and 1997 or something like that, where it seemed like capitalism was stable for a bit. This generates theories that say capitalism can be stable. Whereas I suppose, like now, if you argue that capitalism is a stable system, you look like a bit of an idiot because you've seen that there's like a long-term financial crisis for the last 10 years, you know, where capitalism looks very, very shaky. It needs significant government help to sustain itself as a system. Right, so Bernstein rejected this dialectical view of the world and said that the world isn't necessarily fighting. Class warfare is not necessarily existing. Right? The world isn't based on these opposites constantly struggling. Instead, we can have a world based on unity and compromise as long as we want it enough. So we just have to convince the capitalists that compromise is good, and convince the workers that compromise is good, and then we can make the world a fairer place. So for Bernstein, socialism is more about what's ethically desirable. Socialism should be nice, should be a good idea, that sort of thing. It's not about what's going to happen. Now, Marx and Engels were clear, whether you want it or not, socialism is going to occur because the working class is important, there's more of them than everybody else, they have strategic leverage and that they do all of the work, and the capitalism is going to collapse anyway. So therefore, socialism will occur. You know, Bernstein was not so sure about that and said, well, it would be nice, right? The way to make socialism happen is to convince people that it's better than the previous system. Right? Marx and Engels did argue that it's better than the previous system, but said it's going to happen inevitably anyway. So Bernstein thought that whenever we have parliamentary democracy, this is a neutral government, so a class-neutral government, where the tyranny of the majority and the minority are rejected, and that socialism is the legitimate heir to liberalism. It's the natural extension of liberalism. Right? So Bernstein is also the first Marxist to get called a revisionist. In fact, he probably called himself a revisionist. Revisionism comes from the word revise, and revise seems to have a fairly neutral or positive meaning. You know, where we just look back at something. You revise for my exam, it's like you're studying the stuff that I taught you. You know, that doesn't sound so bad. No, but in this context, it's a bad thing, right? If you call somebody a revisionist, it's not a positive thing. You're accusing them of betrayal. You're saying, okay, we as Marxists had principles. You know, we wanted to change the world. We wanted to give power to the workers. We wanted to do all these big things. And now you're saying that we shouldn't change anything. You know, we should just compromise a lot all the time, right? This is an accusation of betrayal. So Bernstein responded to these accusations by saying he's not revising or destroying Marxism, he's further developing it and applying it to conditions of his day. And we'll see that this argument gets restated by other political leaders later on. So it's enough for now to understand if somebody calls you a revisionist in Marxism, it's not a good thing, right? You're getting accused of betrayal. You're the evil person. So against this we have Lenin, who is significant firstly because he was the leader of the world's first socialist revolution, the Russian Revolution. And he has credibility in that way because people who win immediately have credibility, right? We want to understand why they won. We sort of think, well, they must know something, they must have done something, or they're part of a social movement that knew something, otherwise they wouldn't have taken power. Right? So the fact of Lenin's political success means that people look at his theories seriously and take him seriously as a political leader. So what were his key theoretical contributions? Most importantly is the idea of the vanguard party. This is probably his lasting legacy. Even if people don't follow other stuff that he said as much anymore, I don't know, maybe they do. But the vanguard is still a very real thing, right? China is ruled by a vanguard party. So is Vietnam, Cuba, lots of other countries, right? So what is a vanguard party? It's the Communist Party, but what is the Communist Party? It's supposedly the most advanced party that represents the interests of the exploited class. So in other words, any of us can become the vanguard at any time, as long as we become the most advanced force to represent the working class. Right, so that's what vanguard means. And with the support of these exploited classes, the job that the vanguard has is to impose what's called the dictatorship of the proletariat. Proletariat is just the fancy French term for working class. In other words, to bring about working class rule is the basic job of the vanguard party. So the way that they do this is by imposing democratic centralism. This is how you decide within the party what's a good idea and what's not. Right? And this means that you can have free speech and debate about any political question, and then you vote on it, and then once the party decides what their policy is going to be, every party member is expected to follow that policy, even if you previously disagreed with it. So there's space for democratic debate, and then there's centralized action. The whole purpose of this is to impose what's called the dictatorship of the proletariat, which is probably one of the most misunderstood concepts in all of Leninist theory, simply because it uses the word dictatorship, which in the current day and age we think dictatorship, we think military rule or something like that, right? Now, it's important if we look at Lenin to understand that he saw every society as being a dictatorship of some kind. Because every society gave power to a certain social class. Right? All the capitalist societies gave power to the capitalist class through what he called a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, or a dictatorship of the capitalist, where state power was being used to protect private property and to encourage the exploitation